So the first thing that I'm going to talk to you about is sketchbooks. Obviously, that's where it all starts. You need a book to be able to paint and draw in, or do whatever you want in ink work, whatever. You can do whatever you want in your sketchbook. It's your book. Because the most common question that I'm asked is, what's the sketchbook and what kind of paper is it and where did you get it, etc. And then that's followed up usually by comments about how most sketchbooks are not very good quality. The paper's poor, it's thin, it doesn't take wet media well. So you need a wet media sketchbook. And there's a couple that I would recommend if you don't want to go down the make your own route, which is just a touch too much to ask sometimes when you want to get started. And the main one is Stillman and Byrne Zeta series. It's quite a nice heavyweight paper, and it comes in a range of sizes, and it's a good paper. Now you can probably see there that it's actually quite white though, compared to this Arches paper here. It's got quite a white finish. It's very smooth, the Zeta series, and it's quite white. Now, if you like a white paper, that's fine, but I think it probably has some optical brightness. I don't know that for sure because it doesn't say. But when paper is unnaturally white, usually there's brightness in it. Now, the other thing is that it's got pulp in it, as wood pulp, as opposed to being like a watercolour cotton rag paper. Now, I prefer to paint on a cotton rag paper. And so the Stillman and Byrne being part pulp can be a little bit difficult to handle with very wet washes. If you're a wet painter, if you like to push the paint around a lot on the paper, if you use eradicators and things like that, and you're quite heavy on the paper, it's not going to be great, to be honest. It'll start to lift the surface. You'll feel the difference. If you rub your finger across where you've used heavier paint, you can feel it. And you can feel that on watercolour rag paper as well, but more so on this paper. And the more you work it, the rougher it'll get. So you might need to burnish it down flat. But it's a good sketchbook, and I love this little size that they do. This 3.5 by 5.5 inch size is a great size for taking out with you. So it has got a few flaws in it, like most sketchbooks, but it's a super little book, and the quality of the paper is very good. The size that I recommend for most things is this size. It's 8.5 by 5.5. I think that's about, let me just check, 14 centimetres, about 14 centimetres by 21.5. It's the best size to work in, I think, because you can use that double page spread as well. And this is why I prefer a bound book to a spiral bound book. Spiral bound book is going to have a gap in the middle, so you can't use that continuation across the page. They do it in various sizes. They do it in a hardback version, and here's an A4. Now, to me, this is not a practical book to use to take out. It's far too heavy. Sometimes they don't sit very flat when they're hardbound. By hardbound, you'll see it's got a hard leathery-like cover, which looks very nice, but in terms of practical, it's not so good. So if you want to use it in the studio, it's good for larger things. This paper's great for graphite too, I have to say. But in terms of practical sketchbook that you want to take out and about and go to different places with, it's a bit big, bulky and heavy. So I recommend that size of the 8.5 by 5 inch sketchbook as the ideal size. And that's the size I make my sketchbooks pretty much as well. Now, when I first started with sketchbooks, I used to buy a sketchbook and then I used to stick things into it because I was kind of afraid of painting directly onto the paper, which is a bit of a strange thing, but it's not uncommon for people to do that. Whoops. So here you can see I've stuck a whole sheet of watercolour paper into the Stillman and Byrne book, but there I've actually used the Stillman and Byrne paper, so sometimes I felt more confident about it than others. But I just found the watercolour paper just that much better a surface to work on. And these are some of my early pages. You can see they're kind of not quite so formulated as the ones I do now, and you do get better at filling the pages. And this is a little bit too big. This is another Stillman and Byrne that I've stuck these into. This is the 8 by 10, which is a more square shaped, not square, but more square shaped book. Nice size book, but again, it's just a little bit larger than you might need. But if you want a larger book, if you're painting larger things, you might find that better. So you see a whole range of sizes in Stillman and Burn. Now the other nice sketchbook is the Etcher, and that's this one. Oops, upside down. So this one is a little bit more cream coloured. Compare it to the Stillman and Burn paper. You can see that colour difference there. The sun's come out to cast a shadow over it. It's good on different medium. So Stillman and Burn is too. You know, it's good with graphite and watercolour. I find no problems with it. It's black watercolour, which I quite like painting sometimes, which is nice. It's a good book. It's quite expensive though. It's this white fabric covered one. But it's quite an expensive little sketchbook, and it's not always easy to get. And so another reason why I decided to make my own. Now, one of the easiest sketchbooks you can make is a concertina, and that's this one. And here's one that I just did on leaves, which I only done so much on, but you can see that's made from a full sheet of watercolour paper, which is like torn, folded and torn into strips, and then folded like a concertina, and then I glue on a hard back and cover it with some paper. Very, very easy sketchbook to make. You can make that in no time at all, and you can use both sides of the paper or write notes on it. You know, sometimes I do that. I haven't used the back of it, but you can use both sides in the same way. You can just flick through it like a normal book like that. It's up to you, but that's the easiest form of sketchbook you can make. The ones I make now, just move that one as well, I'll talk about that one in a minute, these are the ones I make myself. And so it's bound. It's a bit tatty now because it gets dragged around a lot. So it's bound. I've put a hard cover on it and an internal paper. So I just buy papers that I like. This is very traditional, this kind of marble paper, William Morris Designs, and I cover this piece of cardboard on the front and back and the side. This kind of holds it all together, and it's stitched, and this one is stitched with what's called a butterfly 4-needle Japanese binding, I think it's called. And the reason I like that particular stitching for a sketchbook is, as you can see, it sits quite flat, but here we've got some big gaps in it, and that's just due to inexperience really, and from putting too many pages in it. So if you are going to make your own sketchbook, don't make as many pages. This has got a whole year's worth, and I think 52 pages in this book. So you can see you get like a page where you've got no stitching, and then you get a page where you can see the stitching and the gap. You see, in the gap got bigger nearer to the middle, and then it gets smaller again nearer to the back. So it was an ambitious kind of quite large book to make, and it's just a little bit too large. And this is a much better thickness, but it's that size, it's that same size, and I just use a full sheet of it's about the same size, a little bit bigger maybe. That's with the cover, but it's a similar size to the Stillman and Burn there, and I just use the size of the watercolour paper comes in. I use 2 different papers for my sketchbooks. This one is Stonehenge Aqua Hot Press, which is a lovely paper. It's not as tough as other papers maybe. Again, it's a little bit more fragile a surface. You can, if you overwork it, it's not so good. But I really like it, and the reason I really like it is you can get very sharp edges on it. So it takes the wash as well, but it doesn't take too many washes. It takes like a decent number of washes, but it's not a paper you would want to overwork, and you shouldn't be overworking anything really. But if you do overwork paper, and people do, then this paper is a little bit more fragile than others. And of course you paint on the front and the back of the paper when you're doing this, so there is a slight difference between them. The front's slightly easier to paint on than the back, but it's not really a big deal. You can paint on both. So that's my Stonehenge Aqua. And the one I'm currently working on is the Saunders Waterford. It's got a little bit of texture in it. Saunders Waterford. Again, difference in the front and the back. The front being slightly easier. The back, the mesh side, is a little bit more difficult to work on. But it's a good paper and it's tougher. You can give this paper a bit of punishment and it'll take it. So that's the other type of paper. So both of those books are stitched using that same method, which sits nice and flat, which is important. And I use a little clip to just hold the pages flat if that's not the case. I use a little metal clip. I don't need to with this book, but some of my books I've made books that are using Coptic stitch and they tend to not sit quite so flat. This was the first one I made. See, this sort of thing happens. So I just use a little clip like that just to hold it down while I'm working in it, and that makes it a lot easier to work in because that's a practical consideration, and that's what happens with some of the hardback books, and the Coptic stitch method is a little bit more likely to raise up at the sides. So that's basically a brief introduction to the types of sketchbooks that I use. There's one more, well there's a couple more actually, but there's one more main one. And it's another Stillman and Burn, and it's a colour paper book, which is a nice option as well for sketching. I'll just move some of these out of the way, getting closer and closer to the camera here. It's a very nice option. So you can get these sketchbooks in any of these colours. So it's got beige paper, it's got black paper, and it's got grey paper, and my favourite is the grey, I have to say, but I've grown to love the black. I never thought I would paint on black paper because I never really liked it, but I've kind of grown to love it. So it's not such a heavyweight paper as their other books, but this book is called the Stillman and Burn Nova Trio because it's got the 3 different colours in, and it's a square format, and you can get the rectangular format in each of the individual colours as well. So another quite nice option, and I use watercolour and gouache in this book for white subjects, which is a nice kind of approach that's a little bit different. So that's the other sketchbook that I keep. I've got lots more to do in the black section. And it's just a case of experimenting with which paper and which sketchbook suits you best. Now there are other on the market that look very appealing, like this lovely looking leather bound sketchbook. It looks really nice. I was just drawn in by that leather cover. Paper's pretty awful though. But you can do some nice graphite work in it. A little bit less tolerant of paint. Didn't do a lot in it. I took it to Australia with me. Found it wasn't great for paint, but I did manage to get some quite nice colour. And the paper's very thin and not very tough at all, so you would work quite quickly on it with washes and some dry brush work. But it takes graphite okay, and it looks nice, it looks nice. It rips very easily as well, but it's a nice looking thing, and it is functional. It's just, if you want a good quality paper, then make your own. I would say make your own is the best advice I can give you, and I'll do a video later about how to do that as well. But there's lots of really good resources on YouTube that'll tell you how to make a sketchbook. And you just need to type in a search for how to make a sketchbook and you'll get lots of different ideas.